Hello everyone, my name's Liberty and today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about inclusive classroom management. In October I had the chance to study the inclusive education minor, and I've also been focusing on developing my inclusive teaching throughout my placement this year. So I was very keen to share some of my ideas and experiences with you during this project. So let's begin by looking at what is an inclusive classroom. This may seem fairly obvious to some, but can be a lot more complicated than you may first imagine. But an inclusive classroom focuses on the idea of an equitable learning space, meaning instead of creating an equal learning space that perhaps most national schools tend to lean towards, where all students receive the same lessons, the same help, same instruction, you would have learning that is more catered to the individual needs of each child. I'm sure all teachers will acknowledge that children have different learning abilities, they learn at different speeds, they learn in different ways, they have different preferences and interests. This should obviously be acknowledged and included in our teaching and our classroom management, basically whenever we're with our students. Because of the great diversity in international classrooms, this is more important for us as future international primary school teachers than any other student teachers, I would say. So we will be focusing on the idea of equitable teaching today. But in order for that to be a reality, for us to be able to make that work, a vital thing we have to focus on is getting to know our students as much as quickly as possible. We need to create the relationships with our students. We need to know what their needs are so we're able to cater to them. An inclusive classroom will not always look the same. That's part of how it works. Two very inclusive classrooms could look completely different depending on what students they have and who they're catering for. Depending on what abilities you have in your classroom, what language difficulties you may experience, if there's any physical disabilities or any other factors that you'll have to consider into your management and your lessons, they will look differently in all of your spaces. My goal for today is to give you information and strategies that you will be able to use in your classrooms, no matter what students you have, and you can obviously tweak and change according to what form of inclusion you need to create in your classroom. In an inclusive learning environment, it is also important to make you, the teacher, seem human, which means sharing personal experiences, maybe sharing your own learning, sharing your development to help demonstrate to students that we are all at different places in our learning, we are all working towards different goals, and that's okay. Creating an environment where children understand that we are all learning all the time, and some of us may be learning at different speeds, and that's okay, is a vital part to include in your inclusive learning environment. Inclusive classroom management is all about making an inclusive learning environment. So we are going to have a look at what does that look like. An inclusive learning environment needs to be welcoming as soon as your students arrive, which means you need to create a space that is welcoming, not cluttered, organized, that all students can feel safe coming to every morning and learning in comfortably. When decorating your space, you need to be mindful of what colors and how much decoration you choose to use, as you may have students with sensory overload, or you may have students that simply get distracted from all the decorations you have around your classroom. Bearing this in mind, with EAL students, it is crucial to have visuals linked to your lessons around the classroom, accessible for all, so they can help your students to follow the lessons. As with all things in an inclusive classroom, it is a little bit of a balancing act, trying to find a sweet spot between helping your students and implementing strategies that could cause problems for other students who are also trying to learn in your space. Because of this, researchers have found that if you leave 20 to 50% of your wall space in your classroom free of any decorations, posters, students' work, it's supposed to create a cleaner, more organized space, and keeps your classroom decorated and in a way that you can have your visuals to assist EAL learners without it feeling cluttered and becoming confusing. It is also important to consider the environment your classroom's in, making sure you have enough lighting, making sure you've got good airflow, that if you're near a busy road, you bear that in mind. Again, for any students that may have a hyper or hyposensory issue, and be extra careful with those students. Lastly, another thing to consider when you are looking at your classroom environment and what it might look like is your classroom layout. So where you choose to create your tables, how your seats are laid out, if you're having morning meetings for your class to come together and join in the mornings, and perhaps even creating a quiet space in your classroom for any students who need some quiet time to relax or to reflect, just kind of have some downtime throughout the day, which is always good to have in your inclusive space. Using table groups to have peers assist each other is also very important. It helps everybody learn better. It helps your students that have understood their concept to practice and to explain it again to another student. It also helps any students that may not be understanding the concept to have somebody try to help them before they come to you. In classrooms with one teacher and about 20 students, it can be tricky to have the time to go and see all of your students, and that can be one way to bridge some of the gaps and be able to move around your students more easily and not always staying with the same students who may be struggling. Next, we will look at how does your classroom feel? Now, in an inclusive classroom, it needs to be a safe place for all of your students, whether they speak fluent English, whether they're learning, whether they struggle with school or they excel. One way of doing this is to always focus on the positives, which sometimes can be a challenge depending on what students you have in your classroom. However, it is so beneficial. I've seen this in practice time and again on my placement, to always focus on your positive reinforcement when one of your students passes a milestone or achieves one of the goals they set themselves. Especially for your students who perhaps are working on different goals. All of your students will be working on different goals as they're working at different speeds. It's important to praise all of them the same, whether they're focusing on being able to write their name or write full sentences. Whatever your child is working towards, you need to encourage and be very positive in all of their progression. Last but not least, what does your inclusive classroom sound like? This is everything from the vocabulary you as a teacher use to make sure everybody feels welcome in your space, as well as encouraging other forms of communication, whether it's Braille, sign language, maybe simply hand signs for children to communicate. This can be very useful to simply not interrupt lessons, or for EAL students for very simple things, needing to, go to the toilet, drink water, they can ask and meet their needs without having to speak English, which can be beneficial for all of your students and for your teaching as well. You could also promote structured communication, such as turn and talk or any stop and jot sort of techniques to help your students gather their ideas before sharing with the class. There's also the do's and don'ts that you can have a look at to get a better idea of some strategies you could also implement in your classroom.